but it was held on the UC San Diego campus, which is a lot nicer place to have a meeting than Baltimore, at the end of 2016. And as you've heard from Heather and Diane, it was a former committee of ILSI North America that was the moving force behind this. But folks from UC San Diego Institute for Public Health, American College of Sports Medicine, and several government agencies were on the planning committee. Apparently some federal agencies don't like to be given credit for organizing scientific meetings. So we had input, even though we were all on the organizing committee. So over the 2 days, there were 14 talks, which isn't a lot, but we intended to have a lot of discussion at the meeting, and so there were several sets of breakout groups and discussion periods. We ended up with about 70 participants, the majority coming from academia, the rest from industry, government, and NGOs. So you've already heard that 4 papers came out of this, published as a single issue from the American Journal of Preventive Medicine. It's ajpmonline.org. They're open access, so you can read them all. And there we have a pointer. Okay, so there's a paper on youth, on adults, on older adults, and then there's what we're referring to as a summary paper, but it was the challenges and future directions that this area really needs to face. So what I'd like to do just in a few minutes is talk about what we learned over those 2 days, where we felt the key challenges were, and to summarize where I think we need to go. So one of the issues that I think everyone acknowledges is we need more accurate and more precise measures for both dietary intake and physical activity. And one of the things I did actually come to a firm conclusion on from this meeting is we're not going to get that from the nutrition field. We need engineers, we need data scientists, we need a lot to collaborate with folks in nutrition, but we're not going to get that innovation from nutrition. And one of the things that I've done is on a number of these slides is try to show you some of the newer ideas. And so we have sort of the standard here, a food journal, there's 24-hour recalls, there's food frequency questionnaires, and everybody agrees there's a lot of sway in those methods. But that's considered the current gold standard. One thing that's available literally in dozens and dozens of free apps from iTunes or the Google Play Store is phone apps. And you can see down at the lower left, there's this little grid that actually enables the user to calculate the area or the volume of food. Of course, this is passive. So you have to remember to snap a photo of what you're doing, and you have to be willing to snap a photo of the Pepsi and the Twinkie snack that you're consuming. An alternative to that is the E button, which was developed by some engineers at the University of Pittsburgh. We're actually testing that at one of my nutrition centers in 7-year-old kids. And currently, the E button has a gyroscope, a GPS, an accelerometer, a camera, a UV sensor to know if the user is indoors or outdoors, a thermometer. They have sensor connectors that could go to electrodes for skin conductance, heart rate, and respiration. And the folks who invented this E-button like to say it's the size of an Oreo cookie. And completely passive, it takes a photo every 7 seconds. I'll tell you, one of the things that we discovered when we planned to use this in young children is what happens if we see that the child is being abused? Whose responsibility is it to report that, and to which authorities? So there are lots of ethical issues which we discussed at the meeting in San Diego. And so there are lots of moving parts to this gear set that all interact. And some of the questions are, do you have research questions to address, which most of us are interested in, but most people who are going to be using this are really doing it for their own benefit, for health assessment, to share with a health professional? Are there different levels of accuracy that are acceptable for those types of approaches? And of course, there is lots of commercial potential in this market. You know, you go to the Play Store and you can see literally 200 dietary assessment apps that are free, let alone the ones that you pay $4.99 for. And how do you choose among those? And in fact, I have an Android phone, my wife has an iPhone, and we walk side by side, and our GPSs say we've covered 20% different distances after we've walked for 3 hours. Who's right? So one of the other issues relates to the convergence of innovations in new tools. You need interdisciplinary research. You need teams of people with different expertise. Again, relating to nutritionists aren't going to be leading this, because nutritionists aren't going to develop any of these products that you see here. So the current state of the art is on the bottom left, the glucometer. All of you know about this. You stick your finger, get a little drop of blood, you put this test strip into the glucometer, and you get a reading. This is a contact lens, there we go, which has a sensor electrode in here. It also has an antenna to send it to a smartphone, a wrist sensor, whatever, and continuous monitoring of glucose in tears, which correlates well with glucose in the blood. I don't think it's been commercialized yet, but there are at least 4 companies that have developed contact lens sensors like this. These are electrodes that are referred to as temporary tattoos, but they use Bluetooth to go to a sensor. And again, optimized or developed for glucose, but there's the potential for other molecules to be sensed here. This is a real tattoo with color-changing ink that shifts in relation to glucose in the serum. And I'm not sure I would want that on my arm, but if you're diabetic, maybe you would tolerate something like that. And then there are wristbands that have no invasive sensors on them. This particular wristband in the upper right has actually been developed to sense sodium, potassium, glucose, and lactate. One of my oldest friends has late onset type 1 diabetes. He has a sensor that's put into his triceps muscle every 2 weeks, and he holds a sensor up to it, gets an instant reading, so he knows what he can and can't eat before each meal. The last one is actually something that was a tooth sensor, which you can see placed on in front of an incisor. Obviously, that's not the place it would be. This was done by some engineers at Tufts University. And this senses glucose, sodium, and ethanol. But again, proof of concept, the engineers think they can sense lots of molecules. I mean, one of the questions I have, obviously, is how quantitative is this? Because as it's passing past your teeth, I'm not sure it's really going to be able to tell you if you're drinking a 3-ounce glass of wine or 2 6-ounce glasses of wine. So these are some of the challenges that are related to this. One of the important aspects that we tried to highlight and had a really thought-provoking talk from Sachin Panda from Stanford is on circadian rhythms. And there are not just daily rhythms that circadian, but infradian rhythms that are multiple days. So sodium is controlled by infradian rhythms that, in fact, the group at Vanderbilt has shown you need probably a minimum of 7 consecutive 24-hour urines to really get precision in sodium status for subjects. So you have a central clock. You know, you hear from your colleagues and friends all the time, oh, I'm a morning person, I'm not, et cetera, et cetera. Well, not only do you have a central clock in the brain, but there are peripheral clocks. And most organs seem to have their own clocks, which aren't necessarily in sync with your central clock. So this is a really complicated area. And it turns out that fasting and caloric restriction affect the gene expression, which is probably the mediator for what's happening with control from circadian differences. And so things, in addition to alertness, when you wake up, there's a rush of cortisol in your system because you got to face the day, and everybody's afraid of that. But you know, your blood pressure goes up, your body temperature goes up. You know, all sorts of things happen, some good, some bad. So the key challenges that were agreed upon is assessing energy expenditure. You know, there are doubly labeled water, there's indirect calorimetry, there's a lot of things that work more or less. Doubly labeled water is considered the gold standard and probably should be because it's the most accurate, but it's the least accessible for most researchers, primarily because of cost and the specialized analyses that are required. But you need accuracy, you need to protect the data, and this is really one of the challenges. We had an ethics talk and we had ethics discussions woven in to the 2 days of the meeting. And again, the standard is a physical activity diary, which isn't very accurate because if you think people aren't honest about what they eat, you know, ask them about how much exercise they do. And apparently, most people in the country exercise just as much as they need. Yet a third of us are obese, another third are overweight, and we're all out of shape. So, you know, Fitbit is also now sort of the accepted standard. You can get heart rate there. You can get blood pressure. There's a company that claims you can get blood oxygen on a Fitbit-like device. And I've not been able to find an explanation of how a wrist-mounted sensor detects blood oxygen, but somebody's selling that for $30. So good luck if you want to get one of those. Then there are, you know, hundreds of phone apps. This one here is just an example, has a GPS, has calories expended, but again, does all kinds of things that everybody wants. So one of the big challenges, of course, is we're going to be swimming in a sea of data, and many of us are going to sink in that sea. So we've got a lot of data, but we don't really know how to reach conclusions on this. And part of this is driven by the healthcare industry itself. You know, we spend the greater proportion of our gross domestic product than any country in history, and by objective measures, I have to speak louder, I'm being told. Okay, we need to, we're spending more than any country in history of our gross domestic product, and that's simply unsustainable. And the healthcare industry is looking for ways to decrease the cost, help people take better control of their health. And more personalized strategies for this will enable that. The problem, of course, is that we're coming up with new and better ways of telling us more about our personal health, and all the government decisions are basically the public health approach, one size fits all. So the question is, when will that merge or be replaced with personalized results? And for every person who said 2 years, 5 years, I wish I had that proverbial nickel because I would be able to retire and not deal with federal shutdowns. So, you know, the issue is we're going to measure stuff. We don't know what that stuff is, but it's going to enable us to do better at it. And so, you know, we just don't know how good we're going to be at measuring the stuff that we're measuring. So one of the key challenges I mentioned is the ethical issues. Informed consent, you know, it's fine if you're using this, but if you got a little camera on your shirt and you're taking pictures of people, what about their privacy? They didn't agree to be in your photos, and somebody is going to evaluate those photos, whether it's research or clinical decisions. What about the protocols for managing that data? You know, who's going to have access to it? And there's really very little thought given to regulation of the privacy of this data. You know, in fact, who owns it? When you download an app to your phone, you don't read that legal agreement, but you click, yes, I agree, all the time. And that's the defense of that company, that you've given them, whether it's Google or some startup of two guys in their basement, you know, you've given those people all of your data and the rights to use it. And so some of you have an Echo in your home. You know, you don't have to say, Alexa, do this. Alexa's listening to you all the time. Maybe one or two of you have bought Facebook's portal, which just came out late last year. That actually tracks you. It has a motor in it with a camera, and it follows you around the room. So not only is it listening to you, it's looking at you. So I hope you've got all your clothing on when the portal's looking at you. And in fact, there have been several anecdotal reports from people that it's turned itself on and followed people around the room without them saying whatever the magic word is to have it start doing that. Yeah. So this is interesting. This is a scale called Sugar Pod. It's obviously more than a scale. It has a scanner built in top and bottom of your feet, looking for diabetic foot ulcers. And obviously for diabetics, that's really valuable. And that's on the market right now. The one on the upper right is Cardia Mobile, 99 bucks. It's what they call a clinical grade EKG. You put your fingers on the sensors, and that's enough of a difference in the electrodes to get this. So the question is, who sees that EKG? Who interprets it for you? Naomi knows how to interpret it, but probably nobody else in the room is an MD and knows how to interpret that. So these are issues that, you know, for 99 bucks, you know, a lot of people can go out and buy that and say, gee, that would be great. But, you know, the data is going to be out there somewhere. And how are we going to maintain privacy for that data? So, you know, there's lots of tools, there's lots of different kinds of data. You know, all the data aren't going to be in a uniform format. How are they going to talk to each other and be used by a research group, a health professional, et cetera? There's different models, there's different designs. How are we going to agree to pull those all together and analyze those statistically? You know, how much user burden is acceptable? And this is one of the real problems in research because, you know, we often give monetary inducements to people or free food or something, and we say, oh, that's enough, you know, but you can't be coercive in a research study. So there's balance of how to decide this. How much error can we tolerate? This is, for research, is really critically important. You know, obviously nothing in this area is going to be perfect, but is 5% variability satisfactory, or is 20% satisfactory? I don't see much discussion about that. And obviously, cost is a factor, usability is a factor. And as you saw at the beginning of my remarks, we had 3 papers on different age groups. A lot of these studies are done in young, healthy adults. It's different from asking a 3-year-old to do the same thing, or somebody who's 85 and maybe potentially impaired physically or mentally to use the same device. So again, things that we talked about. And I mentioned earlier, critically important, who owns the data? Because the user, the actual person who's collecting their own data, invariably does not own the data. So that's a big problem. And one of the keys on this is standards, not for data collection, but standards for data interpretation. We need an ASCII code. If any of you folks remember the ASCII language from early computers, we need something that each analysis program can understand. And to do that, we need an ontology, whether it's the names of foods, description of exercise, or anything else that's collected. So the recommendations that came from the 2 days of discussion in San Diego for dietary intake and physical activity was improve the data infrastructure, create an open architecture, as Microsoft has called it as plug and play, that you just add a new app to your phone or whatever you're using, and it's automatically recognized, and the data architecture can feed into the rest of whatever's being collected on your computer, your Fitbit, whatever it is 10 years from now that will replace iPhones, Fitbits, etc. And again, one of the key points I learned from this discussion is that, like many of the things I showed you, those pictures of examples, the majority of those pictures were not available 2 years ago when we had our meeting, and we didn't know they were in the pipeline. One of the hardest things in organizing that meeting was getting people from industry to talk about what they're doing, because it's all very hush-hush, and it all boils down to competitive advantage. And that's one of the real problems in this area, that we don't know what's coming 6 months from now, let alone 5 years from now. But we need transdisciplinary work and training. Having been a chairman of a nutrition and food science department, one of my pet peeves was we're not training our food scientists or our nutrition graduate students broadly enough. We're training people very narrowly, in depth, and they don't have the broad foundation. How many nutrition graduate students get a course in physiology or endocrinology, or God forbid, microbiology? And the microbiome's pretty damn important, but I might be the only person who's in a nutrition faculty who actually had multiple microbiology courses as a graduate student. We need new biomarkers, and we need better measures of those biomarkers that are non-invasive and don't require user effort. It's got to be really easy and relatively inexpensive. And again, one of the things that we taught our students in our introductory nutrition lab was the concepts of precision and accuracy. And I wonder how many nutrition grad students get that. Because I don't see that when I go to nutrition meetings. I don't see that concept coming across often. So I'm going to summarize my last slide. This is Dr. Expert Opinion here. One accurate measurement is worth 1,000 expert opinions, and credit goes to Grace Hopper for that. That's really the issue. We have a lot of strong opinions in this area. We don't have a lot of good, solid measurements that people don't argue about all the time on this. And that's the end of my remarks. If there's 1 or 2 burning questions, we actually do have time for that, but I can't imagine that anybody disagrees with me. So thanks for your time.
I have a question.
Naomi.
What can I say? Sorry, you want to clap? So one question I have is, did the audience or the group address the generational differences in terms of comfort with respect to sharing personal information? Because I think that would be a tremendous difference in terms of, boomers are more concerned about privacy perhaps than millennials or the next generation.
Well, we actually had a relatively young person do the ethics talk. She was probably half my age.
Yeah, but that's still old, right?
Very good. I'll get her back later. No, there was no specific discussion about comfort with data sharing, but I don't think, I think you're right in the basis for your question that I'm concerned about people taking my data, and I don't let Google keep my location history, for instance. I turn that off, but it impairs my ability to use Google Maps and some of the other things. As a result, they're always reminding me that I'm not playing fair. And so maybe younger people aren't concerned, but somebody does need to be concerned for them, because I don't think it's completely innocuous to share all of your data. It's not just about where you were. I don't want Google asking me to do a review of the restaurant I was in 20 minutes ago, because that always happened when my location tracking was on in Google.
This is Jim. Can I ask a follow-up to that?
Sure.
It seems to me like we, in some ways, we may not have a choice. We become so dependent on using these things that Google Maps says, okay, you don't give me your data, you don't get to use it anymore. I think it's going to be a situation where we may not, at some level we have a choice, but it's going to be hard to make a choice to not participate in these things. So I'm not sure, for most people, how much real control over their own data they're going to have in a reasonable way.
I agree with you, Jim. Two points. One is Google shares the data. They own, well, I don't think Google owns the data. They share the data. So you can keep your data, but they can keep it too. For Google, I don't think they own the data. The other point is get a flip phone. Amy had a question.
Yeah, I just want to say I agree with you that like a lot of the innovations are going to come from engineers and other disciplines besides nutrition. But at least in my experience and some of the things you shared there, that it requires, and I think you'll disagree. I'm just going to emphasize that it requires that they work with nutritionists.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I didn't want to imply that nutritionists are not part of the equation, but the innovations in engineering to get these new applications, it's not going to come from us.
I agree with your point on the interdisciplinary training, but my question with that is, how do we best strike that balance between broad and deep? Is the interdisciplinary training part to kind of just help make sure, increase that awareness? Is it about, driving collaboration? Because we put a lot of burden on grad students and postdocs, and the average age for first grants is getting
Right.
later and later. How do we strike that right balance? Because there really is a need for people, I would say, to do this well, not only to be informed of what the collaborators are doing, but at least have a base level of knowledge so that you can call BS if somebody's peddling something to you that
Yes.
isn't going to work.
Absolutely. In fact, about 20 years ago, ASN had a committee that Steve Zeisel chaired that suggested graduate student curriculum. And when I was in academia, our department found that really useful. We actually revamped our graduate offerings using that as a rationale to pound some of the older faculty who had been teaching the same thing for umpteen years. So absolutely, I really do think we're not going to produce bacteriologists in a nutrition department, but they need to be conversant with the vocabulary and the principles in the gut microbiome and even the oral microbiome. We're going to need to move on, so thanks for your interest. And we have a number of excellent speakers for this morning. And we do have a relatively tight schedule, so I'm going to ask all the speakers this morning to try to keep to time. Our first speaker is Jim Hill, who's going to get an introduction even though he doesn't need one. And Heather actually wrote out a long introduction, so I'm not going to use that. Jim knows everything in nutrition. He's done everything in nutrition. He's going to share a little bit of what he knows with us on assessing energy balance and metabolic biology and regulation. Jim, because of technology, we're going to electrocute you if you go over time. So the floor is yours.